You're very welcome to another episode of the Scaling Your Business podcast. For this episode, I believe it's almost 190, maybe 189. We're delighted to welcome Fergus Connolly. Fergus, you're very welcome to the show.
Rian, thank you for having me.
Delighted to have you, man. For those who don't know, Fergus is a performance coach. He's worked with some of the world's leading professional sports teams, special forces, Fortune 500 companies. I'll list a few of his trusted clients: San Francisco 49ers, Liverpool, New York Knicks, Google, Navy SEALs, Carolina Panthers, US Special Forces, Verizon. I'm sure there's a list of about 50 others, but we'll stop there. People get the picture already. Fergus, first question I'm going to ask you is, a lot of the logos that or names that people would hear would be of those out stateside, but you grew up in Monaghan, if anyone can pick up on the accent. So take me back to what life was like growing up in Monaghan. 6-7-year-old Fergus. Any standout favourite memories?
Yeah, well, I grew up in a place called Scottstown, and only a few miles from the border. So during the 80s, that was an interesting time. And I guess that has stayed with me as well, because it was a really interesting time growing up. Football was huge, of course, still is. And I was very, very fortunate, not just parents, but people in the community, great role models, hardworking, honesty. I think some of the values that, become important. And it's funny when you end up working with, good teams and great people, you start to notice the same values that you noticed growing up, like hard work, honesty, work ethic. I remember being down, not name drop, I remember being down at Munster, with O'Connell, O'Gara, O'Callaghan, these guys, and you start to notice the very same values that you saw growing up playing football in Scottstown. And you start to realize, okay, there are common themes among very successful, driven people.
So tell me this then, before we get to the likes of O'Gara and all those places, and we may never get to them, surely there were some people that you could pick on, whether teachers, loved ones, friends, maybe even perhaps acquaintances that had a massive influence on you in your early days that subsequently helped you become the person you are today. If you were to pick, let's say, one or two of those people to kind of give them a shout out and explain the influence they had, who would those be?
Absolutely. My parents, of course, but after that it was Scottstown GA, Scottstown Football Club. So many people there. Probably he was principal at my school as well. Sean McCaig would have been one of the very first figures, role models, examples. Like I remember being lifted over, turnstiles in Clonus, watching this man who was a giant on the sideline, and then going into school and seeing this big shadow coming down the corridor, and you're in awe of somebody who was on the sideline, was maybe on television, and he's walking through your school. And then years later getting to play football actually against some of the guys that you saw playing for Monaghan, at Scottstown years later, being in the locker room. They were coming towards the end of their career, but those basic values, like Gene Sherry, Fergus Caulfield, Jerry McCarville, Jack McCarville, so many like players who played for Monaghan were playing for my club team. And the funny thing, it's kind of hard to explain, I guess, but these guys were, like I said, they had done everything, but practice was as tough and as brutal and as hard for me coming through at 16, 17 as it was probably for them. And they were not going to let you come and take their shirt or take their jersey or get their place. Or even just, I remember sitting on the sideline. I was the only substitute. And I was not brought on. I was the only guy. They didn't even bring me on for 5 minutes at the end because I just wasn't good enough. I wasn't up to their standard. And that was the pride. And people might, I guess today maybe there's participation trophies and stuff like that. But back then, no, you earned it. And those lessons, I remember sitting in locker rooms, or changing rooms afterwards, and some of the older guys either giving you advice or you asking them for advice. Like I remember Fergus Caulfield telling me that it still sticks with me. He had he would go to England during the storms. He was working for Telecom, and they would help working. And he, in order to stay fit, would play squash. In the off season, Fergus, that's what you got to do: play squash. That's what I did when I went. Other stories about him actually. I never got to find out if this. He when he had his cruciate knee injury, he would cycle the Bragan Mountains along the border. But before he would set off, he would take the seat off his bicycle so he could not sit down for the hour and a half he was cycling to build it up. So that's the culture, the environment, the standard that you come into as a 15, 16-year-old. So when you come into that environment, the standard is the standard. You're either going to rise to it or you're not going to make it. It's up to you. Yeah. I drove home. I remember driving home from practice, from training. My mother's Ford Fiesta. I remember crying. Training was that hard, like mentally, not physically, mentally. Just the abuse. I'd made mistakes. Wasn't getting, and I don't know, I was 17 or something. But I was crying driving home. I had to, like, that's how tough it was. But again, you either made it or you didn't. And certainly
builds character, even if you're sitting on the bench.
Yeah, and it also, when it comes to competition, when it comes to winning, and you have an external opponent, the external opponent isn't going to care. They're not going to give you 5 minutes.
Yeah.
So, and I am so grateful for every lesson. So grateful. Like, only for Scottstown, only for that place, for those people, I wouldn't have done anything. Nothing. I would never have done anything. They set a standard, and that was Scottstown, not Monaghan, Scottstown. Like, it set a standard for what was expected.
Big shout out to Scottstown. Hopefully they got your plaque going up soon.
No. But that's the other thing. Like, there's there's 30, 40 guys who've done far more than I have done. Do you mean, so you, like, there's people that, like I said, people like Sean McKeag, you're still in awe of, 20 years
Get in
later.
the queue.
Get in the queue, absolutely.
Get in the queue, yeah. Tell me this, I often find that many correlations between sport and business, but there's one that I find difficult to wrap my head around, and it's, I've been to a few conferences where you get to hear the likes of potentially Brian Cody, Kilkenny manager, for any non-Irish fans, or Jurgen Klopp speak at conferences. And it's the part that I find difficult is if a player has a bad attitude, you can drop the player. If you're in business and a sales rep has a bad attitude, you can't just drop the sales rep. Take Brian Cody, for example, phenomenal manager, just retired. Nobody's place was guaranteed in that team. From Henry Sheff and DJ Carey, all the top greats, they had to fight for their place. And if they had a bad attitude, they were dropped. What? Am I the first person to say something like that to you, where I struggle with that kind of comparison? Have you got any thoughts on it?
No, you're 100% right. And I first noticed that not with my work in business, but actually in sport, because some sports are like that. Obviously, when you get to the professional level, but as you're coming through, if you have, and there's a very big distinction between a Premier League team and, say, an American team. In an American team, it is absolutely, yes, we can move players. But if you have an academy structure, that player's coming through. So you have to inherit, if a player has come through your academy. So you have an obligation, and that's very important as well for the integrity of the game. So some sports are different, and certainly then, of course, some clubs are different. But it does come from the top down in terms of how are we going to look after our players? Are we going to invest in them? It also is definitely a mindset from the top down. Do we develop talent or do we identify talent? And that's the same in business. But the one thing that, in my experience, is if you develop talent and invest, not just invest, but if you develop it, you can build sustainable success over time. success that will last. So, you know what I mean? If you look at players like Steven Gerrard, if you want to talk about Liverpool, or if you go back to Manchester United, there's a legacy and inheritance, a culture that comes through with that player that will help sustain success over a period of time, as opposed to buying and recruiting talent. Now, it's still important, obviously, to bring in certain players, but you have to have a balance between them if you want to build something that will truly dominate. And I've been around organizations, been involved in organizations that have had that, just buy and sell. The problem is, and it's not just, I know you're talking about players, but it's not just players, it's staff. Every time somebody leaves, they've, to use the phrase, they know where bodies are buried, but they know how so many small things operate, like the oil that makes the organization run well. So if you lose somebody on your backroom team that has a wonderful local network, and let's say you have to find a solution quickly, but that person's gone now. Now you're reaching out to strangers, even in the locality, whereas you might have had somebody on board who knew exactly where to go, get a solution, fix it, and move on. So being able to respect all of the people that you have in your organization and recognizing the importance of developing talent is it's critical. Again, it depends. Do you want to build something sustainable or just get an instant result?
You're dead right. And before we jump into this book, one of the things, or a couple of things I want to touch on, are some of the kind of business blind spots, because the typical audience that listens to this are entrepreneurs, MDs, CEOs across UK and Ireland, that are in scaling companies. One of those blind spots that I've seen, touching on what something you just said, was kind of not building your bench, so that if a player does leave, you don't have someone, even if you've not got the talent internally, to turn to externally, that you've been kind of nurturing over a period of time. Another blind spot that I'm going to tie to a quote that I got from this book was, you must empower the players, don't try to play from the sidelines, don't micromanage. And it reminded me of a lesson a sales leader taught me once, which was around learned helplessness. The idea of sales rep coming to this sales leader and saying, I've got this issue, can you help me with it? And the sales leader said, pretend I wasn't here, what would you do? Or come back to me in 30 minutes with a solution and we'll work on it together. So when you say you must empower the players, don't try to play from the sidelines, can you expand on what you mean by that?
Yeah, that's so important. And actually, even I personally have found myself before, notice, when something comes up, you automatically ask someone, who's that person? And I do try to stop asking questions and figure it out for myself. I've got a phone, I've got Google, I can, but if you don't stop yourself at that stage, you start to, use learned helplessness. I've not heard that term used. I've not heard that term used in a while. Actually, that, believe it or not, is used in interrogation, because you want to actually encourage the person to learn helplessness and to rely on you, and then so that's the extreme version of it. Like, you end up, somebody is not going to do something for themselves; they're going to become overly reliant. What you want is, and I use the term PlayStation. You don't want coaches or managers playing PlayStation with you on the field. So your staff, you're not a PlayStation manager. You teach them, you empower them, and you let them go and allow them to make a few mistakes so they can keep learning. But otherwise, you're never going to get anywhere, and you're not going to be able to develop leaders. That same person's going to come later and they're going to say to you, I don't have any leadership in my group, or I don't have any, initiative in my group. Well, why do you think that is? The best manager I saw do that was definitely Jim Gavin, without a doubt. You remember watching him on the sideline?
Yeah.
And by the way, can I just mention one thing about Brian Cody, because he wouldn't remember this, but it's probably 20 years ago. I reached out to Brian Cody, asked to meet him, to ask him some questions, and yeah, absolutely made time. Irish people sometimes don't give enough credit to people making time. Pete McGrath did it for me years ago as well. Like, if you reach out and ask people for help or guidance, there's a lot of great coaches, great people out there who will do that.
Potentially because they've been in the same position themselves before.
Yeah, they're just decent people, yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. I feel like what I'm about to do is like those things where I don't know if you had any siblings growing up. They might throw a plate at you so you could catch it real fast, or throw a ball so you could catch it real fast. In your book, you say there's no such thing as discipline.
Hmm. Yeah.
Can you expand on that? Because there'd be a lot of
So
questioning you as to why you put such a statement in your book.
yeah, because it goes back to that idea of micromanaging people. If you're disciplining something, it can turn very, very quickly into actually bullying and intimidation, if you will. What you really want to do is you want to encourage self-discipline, like that you or that person has their own self-discipline. But the idea that I can discipline someone, I can set rules, I can punish someone, but that's not developing the person. And so you want to encourage them, you want to reward them for showing self-discipline. And so there's a very, very thin line between, as a leader, setting targets, well, not targets, the wrong word, but, punishing, setting very, very strict fences, and then, jumping on them when no, you really want to see somebody who showed discipline, whether it was in a meeting or throughout their career. That's what you really want to reward. That's self-discipline, as opposed to me disciplining someone.
You've been a um, performance coach for a long period of time, but looking back in on your own life, and I'm aware it's easy with hindsight, but how beneficial, speaking to CEO founders here who potentially are lonely from growing a business, how beneficial is it to look to others for help? Because some people perceive it as, I don't want to be a hindrance or even a weakness.
Oh yeah, I've gone through. I've made that mistake. I've made that mistake myself. I think early on, for some reason, it was easier to to approach people, look for guidance, look for help. But as you start to accumulate or do something, you almost start to become more worried about what you've done as opposed to continuing to ask and reach out to people. But like, thankfully, it's something that I've learned. Even and I make a point of doing it regularly to touch base, because it's like it's like a player before a line out. The first thing they'll do is they'll check and see where they are on the field. Forget about with everybody else, and then where am I in relation to everybody other players. You need people that you can speak to, call, to keep your reference, see where I am. Am I looking at this the right way? Am I in the right position? And they very often shouldn't be actually in your industry, because you can end up very quickly with echo chambers. If all of the people you're talking to are just looking at the same elephant from the same perspective, you all just see the same thing. And it's good to have people with varying experiences. One of the things that I've found helpful as well is working with very experienced, or asking very experienced mentors, and younger ones as well, because you learn, gives you different perspectives on the same challenges. So having a group of people that you can use as references has always been very helpful, for me.
Absolutely. Three kinds of people in life in your book: sheep, wolves, sheepdogs.
Yeah,
You've
yeah.
got to explain.
Well, it actually comes from a guy. That's not my thing. I didn't invent it. It's a guy called Dave Grossman, who's done a lot of work in the military. But you, when you're going through tough times, and you lean on people, you want to be able to lean on sheepdogs, because there are people who are going to take advantage of you, wolves obviously, but also then there are sheep, so to speak, that you lean on them and they'll tell you everything's okay and you're doing great, when really what you need a sheepdog, somebody who is able to tell you the truth honestly. No, you're not doing a good job, or yes, you are. And so knowing who you're asking advice from and knowing who you're leaning on is very, very important, especially when times get difficult. But again, it's not the day of the wind, the day of the scallop. You have to have those as part of your inner circle, people that you lean on, because
Absolutely.
everybody, particularly particularly people scaling at a fast rate, they need people around them.
100%. I've put a couple of markers in your book, and for those watching the video, they'll see me hold up your book. For those listening, 59 lessons working with the world's elite coaches, athletes, and special forces. One of the quotes on top of the book is, "It's all about them, the team, not about you." From Graham Henry, the All Black World Cup winning head coach. Endorsements from Bill Sweetum, which is an Olympic Hall of Fame swim coach, to people from NASA, to US Navy SEALs, other performance coaches, a variety of things. One, I've picked out 3 that I want to touch on here, Fergus. Page 201, leaders with very high staff turnover have either poor culture, treat team members with disdain, or have very little to offer in the way of developing people. At best, these organizations float, make no progress. At worst, they fail, and sometimes dramatically so. For those with... How do you recognize that that is an issue, first of all? And I tell you why. I picked this because I was on the bus yesterday morning, and my friend said to me, he's an architect, an architectural technologist, in case he's listening. And he was part of a team of 15 in January. And since then, the team was now 6. And I said, where's the rest of the team gone? And he said, the boss is the worst boss ever. He micromanages. He doesn't know how to lead. He consistently gives out, checks in. Now that we're gone remote, there's one day remote. He wants everyone to match up with the same. I digress. He has a staff turnover issue. And this quote, when I read it, made me think of him. So when I read that quote to you, how, very high level, do you think those leaders can flip that and develop their staff to stay with them, to retain, and not only retain, but then attract high talent? Because like that leader, there's 9 new architectural technologists on the market that are phenomenal at their job that someone else could attract if they're a good leader.
Yeah, so like my journey, the whole way still is, my journey starting out was, how do you be good? And then when you get there, you realize, hang on, there's this other level of great or elite, and what is that? And when you're always looking for clues. And the first person actually that told me, hey, look at the turnover, look at the staff, was actually Jose Mourinho's mentor, a guy called Vitor Frade in Portugal. And he was talking about, he was referring to some other coaches, and he was saying, if you notice the amount of turnover that they have, that will give you a great indication as to the type of, not just coach, but person they are. Now, if you want to build a sustainable, like a truly dominant organization or team, doesn't matter whether sport or business or anything, you have to have people who are going to stay for a period of time so they can refine their skills and continue to improve. But you have to have a clear vision that you can share with people, that they can feel part of. They have to see their value in it and understand what their role is. And again, allow them and encourage them to do it. But if you join an organization, you don't know what the vision is, or you don't see your place in it, you don't see how you're contributing, why would you stay? Now, you can pay money, but that's bribing someone essentially. Do you really want the whole relationship to be based on money? Because the reason they're going to leave you eventually is because somebody's going to offer them more money.
Yeah.
And there comes a point where money is not the goal. People are looking for something more than just a pure financial reward.
Absolutely. So,
and one of the sorry, Rian, one of currently, if you look at two real reasons that people leave currently, one is alignment of purpose. And am I working for somebody that, because people have such a great social conscience, social interest now. The second one is, am I developing professionally? Mm-hmm. It's one of the key things. It's one of the reasons that I get approached most often now, is because staff want to know that not only is there a vision, but you have a vision for me. Yeah. That I'm going to develop, I'm going to continue to improve.
So that always confuses me, and I'm probably going to go off on a tangent here, because I've seen that a couple of times from the world I've spent time in, But then when leaders invest or develop or put money into their staff through training or leadership training or whatever it may be, there's only about 10 to 15% of that group of people that will actually take something from it and do, like, you know, move up one or two steps in the ladder. I've been in the fortunate position to be in a couple of the tech companies where I'd know some of the trainers, and I spent time in that world where I'd sit in the room and I'd watch it, and you have the back player, which is on their laptops, and a call comes in, they got to disappear and take the call because it's more important than upskilling. And then there's the middle layer, which are kind of like, they could challenge the trainer because they're like, I know more than this guy. And then there's the front layer that actually absorb and take it in and will pick one or two golden nuggets and test it and bring it into their own world. So I'm always kind of conscious of, and I'm not challenging you in any way on this. It's just more like, people say that, but do they really mean it? You know, I think they like the idea of it more than, I'm talking more about the kind of back 15, 20%, not the kind of upper 20, 25%.
But I think, and that's why I hate using the word invest, because the idea there is that it's about money. It's not. It's about helping the person first and foremost look at who they are, and then asking and helping them find out what their, I don't call them weaknesses, but what's the area of opportunity, and
like
that they want to improve in. Like, and you're absolutely right. If you get a group of people, bring them in, say, we're going to do this training, there is 30% that don't need it. There's 30% that don't need it, and they're going to get bored. And very often, they might be the best, they might not. It'll change. But if you're putting people into rooms and asking them to do something that they don't see value in, as opposed to asking and finding out, and there is a process there where, okay, what do you think you need? And there's always two things. There's what they want and then what they need. And you want to bring both of those together. Like, somebody says, oh, like, you know, I want this training. And after a few iterations, you go, actually, you know what, you're right, I actually need this other area developed. So, of course, take a shotgun, fire it, you'll hit 30%.
Yeah, it's kind of the idea of, I think what you're getting at is kind of tying the individual's personal goals to the overall corporate goals of that organization.
Very much so. And if you have that alignment, you've something pretty special. Again, you know, using a sporting example, if you will, but that was one of the great things about, you know, the Dublin football team under Jim. It was very clear that, yeah, we want to win, but there's also something greater than us. There's a legacy, and again, we're all contributing to that. So those, again, having that in place, and then having the awareness and having it culturally that none of us are perfect. We have to improve on different things. I'm going to work on this. What are you going to work on, or what are you going to improve on? It doesn't. It's not a shotgun. It's not everybody's going to get the same thing.
I like that. One of the other points I want to touch on in the book, page 126. Your strength is your strength. And by the way, anyone listening or watching this, I'll leave links to purchase the book below, whether you're watching a promo snippet, because I'll pull this as a snippet, or you're listening or watching the book. The links will be below in the comment section or the description, so you can click and purchase it. I'll put both.com and .co.uk, Amazon, and any other potential. I'll put your website and all social links as well, Fergus. And I'll give that a shout out before the end as well. Your strength is your strength. This is how you win games. But always be aware that your opponent might try to use it against you. You must limit the possibility of this happening, maximize your ability, and never allow your biggest strength to become your greatest weakness. You say, recognize the reality of this situation you're in and know your enemy. Talk to me. Why is it so important to know your enemy?
Yeah, well, it kind of ties into exactly or similar to what we're talking about before. When you work with people, what you want them to identify is, okay, what am I good at? Where's the area of opportunity? Again, not a weakness, but also to recognize, are they leaning excessively on certain strengths? You know, they can become super strengths. And then it becomes this case where you open up the toolbox, you only see a hammer, and you always go for the hammer. But with the group that you might be working with frequently, now they're just getting numb to that. So it becomes like, you've done it. You've gone into a meeting and, you know, somebody said, oh, here he's going to go again, or he or she's going to go get the same thing. Now, that person might have been a brilliant communicator early on, but they haven't developed anything else. They've not developed perhaps the empathy, the understanding, the other skills that can continue to amplify that. And they're just leaning on one thing only. Now it starts to become almost a weakness, and then it's just, that's the only thing they have. So as you grow and as you develop, it's about recognizing, okay, what are the other areas that I can develop so that I'm just not relying on this one trick all of the time. That's one of the most important things where people start to plateau. And sometimes it can be quite sad because they struggle to understand, why am I not having the same effect? Well, you went up this very steep performance curve. Now it's plateaued because people are used to it, but you've not added anything else. Whereas early in your career, that's all you were doing.
We've all heard the quote, and I'm referencing this quote because one of the lines in the book is talent is important. We've heard the quote, hard work beats talent and talent doesn't work hard. So my question here is, how important is it to have a balanced team rather than an over-reliance on potentially one or two eight players?
Yeah, it's a great point. You need to have the simplest way to look at it is, the three C's: capacity, capability, and character. And character is one that, let's just ignore that for a second, because we'll assume that we hire people with good character.
Yep.
But you have capability, which is skill and ability, and then you've got capacity, like how much is someone going to do? And what you want to be able to do is manage both of those people so that the person who's got great capability or great talent is not just relying on that and becoming lazy. The person who doesn't have perhaps the skill or necessity is just putting in long hours, because you now know exactly how both of them are going to fail. The very talented person is going to get lazy, complacent, cause issues, whatever. The person who's just going to work hard is just going to burn themselves out, and they're not going to develop. So that's where, again, leadership and management comes into play, where you know how to manage these people, be able to recognize what they need and what they don't. Because again, and that's back to strengths and weaknesses, acknowledge what the strengths are, but recognize, okay, there are other things I need to bring up. I don't want the strength to end up becoming the weakness, to becoming the limiting factor, so to speak.
I've got three more questions for you before we wrap up. This one I'm curious on, because I feel that the answer changes depending on a person's life stage. But what's your definition of success? What does it mean to you?
Yeah, so the way that the conversation I have around success, it is, you're right, very personal. But there's three areas that, broadly speaking, look at. The obvious one is professional, which is the one that is the priority early on. The second one that comes into play then more is your personal, which is around health and wellness. And the third one then that finally comes in. Now, truthfully, all three exist in tandem. They don't come one after another. But you're absolutely right. They become a greater priority. And the third one then is purpose. As you get older, well, your kids now perhaps are your purpose, or you've got a greater purpose. You want to make a change in the industry or a change in society. So it's very much professional, personal, and then purpose. And you can break those down further, but those are the different stages that you go through. And you will find people who will struggle again, particularly around purpose, actually, interestingly enough. You're too young, you haven't reached that stage yet. But you'd see people at different life stages will struggle. There's one guy speaking to recently, just sold his company, made a lot of money, traveling around the world, and he was saying to me, Fergus, and I'm actually a little bit lost now. I don't feel like I've got a purpose. He was very clear about it, like he could recognize what it was, but a young guy sold his company, made a lot of money, and now it's the purpose. He's looking to find what that is again.
Interesting. It was Scott's
the other area you see it, believe it or not, with younger people in pro sport, just so people can relate to it, is if a player gets a career-ending injury or serious injury, they've identified their purpose, their identity with being just an athlete. So they haven't even had a chance to form a purpose or an identity, and that's been taken away from them. So that actually can be very severe. Or you see it in military transitioning out because they've had a purpose. Do you know what I mean? They've had a purpose.
Yeah.
So, but in very much in the corporate world with executives, you do see it at stages where they'll change.
Kind of like
Career.
an over reliance on that one area you're focused on for so long. And I guess it's important to have a super focus on that area if you're an elite athlete in the NFL or in boxing or in potentially the Navy SEALs, that like you've got to be ruthless and selfish at the same time. But then when you leave that world, your whole world was that.
Yes, but you should have it ideally developed or be developing it all through your life, so that you have something in place, and that's the same for every. It actually again becomes a disadvantage not to have that. And when you look at the people who can sustain success, they have naturally a very clear idea of what's important to them at an earlier stage than others. That is clear, and they overcome setbacks much better because of that.
This is going to sound awful, but like, and a name that popped into my head when we're talking about this, because I know that she doesn't date and she's devoted her whole life to boxing, is like, I hope Katie Taylor's going to be okay when she retires.
I'm sure she'll be fine. I've never met Katie Taylor. She's an incredible athlete and ambassador.
It was Scottstown in Monaghan where you grew up, wasn't it? Got that right?
Oh gosh, I've mentioned it so many times, Rian. You can't have forgotten already. Yeah.
If you were brought back to Scottstown to the school there to give a talk, what's the topic you're talking on?
Oh, I'd that would probably be the most nerve-wracking talk. I've given talks in front of incredible people. That'd be the most nerve-wracking. I think appreciating the values that people are surrounded by. I gave a talk in Australia a number of years to the AFL Association, and I start off by telling them that this was the second greatest sport in the world, after Gaelic football, which they loved. But the warning, I suppose, that I gave them was to respect and to see the value of the amateur game and the lessons it teaches them. So the culture, the community, the sport, the challenge, the struggle, the wins, the losses, the lessons that it teaches young people for life are invaluable. You don't get that in professional sport. Yeah. And that is why the GAA is such an important piece of the fabric of Irish society, and that value is, you cannot put a price on it. That's what I got from it.
If you were in charge of adding a mandatory subject to the high school or secondary school curriculum, what would it be and why?
I think I would add it as a component of all subjects, but I think the importance of discovery and failure is critical. I think that one of the greatest threats to very developed societies at the minute is the fact that the education industry, which it has become, is now very, very formulaic. A plus B, learn that, go in and write C. But when you leave that and you come out as an entrepreneur, as a business owner, you're going to struggle with failures. There is no formula. There's lots of failures. So it's the process of learning from failure and how to overcome it. So that discovery learning aspect, failing, learning why you fail, learning how to overcome it, that is the most important part of the education system, second to the content. So long as that discovery and inspiration in each of the subjects, I think that's critical. I think that's what the Irish education system has been known for. You know what I mean? I think I'm, again, very fortunate to have been a product of the education system in Ireland, and with some amazing, wonderful teachers. I remember writing English essays, and you couldn't stop me because a teacher was inspiring, letting me go write. I would write tomes, I'd write short stories. I was encouraged to do it, and essentially allowed to write what I wanted to. But when you light a flame in a kid, It's just nothing more dangerous. You can't stop it. Keep it going.
I love it. Fergus, it's been an absolute pleasure having you on the podcast. I hope my guests have enjoyed it as much as I have. I've mentioned the book. I'll leave a link to both books in the comment section where you're listening or watching to this, including the links to your socials, your website, and a fascinating TED Talk, which I hinted at in one of my questions throughout this conversation. But for now, we'll leave it there. Thanks again for being a fantastic guest.
Rian, it's been an absolute pleasure. Thank you for having me.